Okay, thanks. Welcome to this webinar today looking at the whole pupil approach to assessment. My name is Phil Wileman and today I'm joined by my colleague Jonathan Thompson.
Hello.
Okay, and we're going to go through this whole pupil approach. This is a model that we've been working on for a number of months, over the years in fact, at GL Assessment, looking at how we can best put together assessments and combine their power. I mean, it's always been our view that an individual assessment, however good it is one strand of a bigger picture. So this model really is trying to bring together aspects of a pupil's attainment, ability, and other influences to their potential on a daily basis. So this little representation here isn't exact, but it does give you an idea. So why 4 parts? Because we very much view that teacher assessment, that day-to-day assessment that you're able to do, is a vital part of this whole picture. Yes, what we do is something different. I think we do bring something different to the table, as it were, for assessment. And what we do is we bring assessments that are perhaps more benchmarked to a national picture, normative assessments. So performance is always referenced to that national sample, which is obviously very, very hard to do within a school or a classroom. So teacher assessment is very much integral to the model. And where we've added to that, looking at ability, barriers to learning, identifying barriers to learning and trying to mitigate their effects, and also to do perhaps more usual types of assessment where we look at day-to-day attainment and performance levels. Really at the heart of that model is the idea that we can pair up ability and performance levels, and using standardized scores, which is the common scale that we use throughout these assessments, we're able to compare performance, attainment, if you like, against ability that gives us more of an idea of potential performance if learning barriers aren't in place. And then by comparing those two standardized scores, where there's a difference, we're able to see perhaps where there are learning barriers and where we can then go on to identify those barriers and where we're able perhaps to mitigate them, to maybe not always remove them, but certainly inform how we can get around them perhaps. So that core for us is looking at ability against current performance, and then from that trying to identify those barriers. So that's very much reflected in something that we call the complete digital solution. What we've done is we've put together a package of assessments that fit around that model. So we have assessments that inform attainment, look at ability, that potential if you like, and then also where we can try and identify where children might be held back by other aspects, so identifying barriers to learning. So assessments built around that model form what we're calling this complete digital solution. So what's in the complete digital solution? Well, there's a list there, but we will be looking at these individually, so more detail later. But what we've got there is progress test series in the core subjects, maths, English and science. And also by the side of their names here, you can also see the age ranges. New group reading test, obviously reading and literacy is vital in allowing access for students to the curriculum. Single word spelling test, again, another aspect of literacy. If you have problems with spelling, then you very well may be held back in the speed of your work, constantly having to look back and think, have I done this correctly? Or you might not even want to use the written word because you're frightened of being judged by a poor spelling. Dyslexia and dyscalculia screeners to look at specific learning problems for dyscalculia and dyslexia. And then pupil attitudes to self and school, which is an attitudinal survey, and Kirkman-Rao survey, which is about whole school perceptions.
Hello, I just wanted to add in a word here for those of you who are working in university technical colleges and studio schools, in other words, dealing with the older children and whether this complete digital solution is appropriate for you. So you've got some, there were some ages for the assessments on the previous page, but I just wanted to cover the fact that CAT, for example, will measure ability up to 17 years and beyond, so that you can keep a track of a child's or a young person's ability, should I say. Similarly, with the attainment measures, at the very least, they'll provide you with a baseline measure from which you can work, and some, in most cases, some pretty early year-on-year progress. New group reading test, as you'll see later on, and the past measure of attitudes, as you'll see later on, these are assessments that we can use to identify those literacy barriers that Bill was talking about just now, and then work from that. So the complete digital solution is very appropriate for that older group, age group of students.
Okay, let's start having a look at that model and we'll look at the various parts. So if we turn firstly to attainment. In terms of attainment, the two mainstays here for year-on-year progress and attainment tracking are the progress test series now and the new group reading test. The progress test series are new assessments that are in response to the changes in the English national curriculum but are applicable across the countries that make up the UK. These are new assessments. In fact, progress test science, we've never had an equivalent in the past. I suppose the equivalents to the progress test maths and English would be the progress in maths and the progress in English, if you know those assessments. But these are completely new written assessments. New group reading test is a test of reading, surprisingly enough. Online, it is an adaptive test, our first adaptive test, so we don't have to worry about ceiling and baseline effects. It will adapt after a number of questions to the specific reading ability of the student doing the assessment. So it does feed into the attainment part because many schools do use it for year-to-year tracking or even pre-post intervention type tracking. But it also features in learning barriers, and I think Jonathan will be talking about that more later. Just to give you a bit more detail about the progress test series, I've said that they're new, entirely new. In fact, the progress test in maths, the secondary edition of that, won't actually be available until spring. They're that new. And it is a completely new standardization. The reports, a little bit more on that, in the same theory as the new reports for the CAT testing, which is an ability measure, we're featuring those as for audiences. So we've had a complete rethink of reporting to make it much more accessible and explained in terms of narrative. So overall, their purpose is to give you that national benchmark. They sample the curriculum of the UK and on that reflect on expected and above and below expectation levels for particular year groups across the entire UK. So that makes them ideal for year-to-year tracking. And as we've said in the model, the fact that we can put attainment alongside ability, where perhaps the ability doesn't reflect any current problems that the student might have, is an easy way into seeing underachievement, for example. So I mentioned the reports. Yes, indeed, we're trying to tailor these for particular audiences. So there's a group report for teachers, and that has, surprisingly enough, the overview of the scores. It doesn't involve the individual scores, but they are listed within a group. An individual student report for teachers, there's a lot more detail for that one individual. And as part of that adding annotation, we've actually got extended narrative which tries to contextualize the particular data score and give information to teachers as perhaps the meaning of that data. So it really is trying to get data into information. And something that's new to the series is an individual report for parents. I'm sure you don't need me to lecture about the more people that are involved in that process of education, then the more it is seen as important, the more that we can work together and really maximise performance. If you're part of a cluster, a trust, a federation, we can also do reports that do comparative reports for schools, very useful for those larger groups. And a combination report is where we sit alongside that attainment data with ability. Not going to mention much more about that now because, again, I know Jonathan wants to talk about that towards the end. What you can see on the screen, or maybe you can't see much in the way of detail, I wouldn't be too worried about that because actually I'm just going to talk about the style of the report rather than the individual content. So there we've got a group, part of a group report for teachers. It has the individual's names, it has a pictorial representation of their standardised age score, and it is standardised age scores, just to remind you, that allow us to make that comparison from individual to individual against national sample and from assessment to another assessment. This is actually a new group reading test report, so you can see it does have reading ages, and it does also give information. The last two columns talk about SC and PC. SC is merely sentence completion, which is kind of the mechanistic part of reading, and then passage comprehension, which is more about understanding. I don't want to steal Jonathan's thunder on that, so I won't say any more at this time. Carrying on this kind of deconstruction of the model then, if we now turn to ability, the assessment that really fits the whole of the ability is the cognitive abilities test. The latest version is CAP4, and again, that's fairly new. It actually came out in 2012 and reflects all modern research on abilities testing. It in many ways is quite an improvement from its predecessor, CAP3, and I'll just highlight some of those changes in the next few slides. But its role in that model is to give us that step outside current attainment and to look at perhaps what could be. So the CAP4, this is an example for a young gentleman called Daniel, and here you can see that it's giving standardised scores, again, that common scale, in the 4 parts that make up CAP4, which are verbal, quantitative, non-verbal, and spatial. The difference between CAP4 and CAP3 in terms of batteries or parts is that spatial. This is a really important new area which shows a strong correlation with success in subjects called STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering and maths. And I don't know of another abilities test that is actually looking at that spatial reasoning. So we made that change to reflect that research that's coming out. This is a further example of Daniel's report. This is an individual student report for teachers, and it shows his position on this rather colourful scattergraph. Now, I don't want to go into heavy detail about it, but what I would say is that what we're using is verbal and spatial as being opposite extremes of a continuum showing the kind of cognitive strengths and weaknesses, the way that a student will take on and process information. And obviously, if we're aware of how they can do that best and where they might struggle, we can perhaps adapt our delivery or even content to make sure that that person is not hindered by working in a way that they will find particularly difficult. This one, for instance, suggests that Daniel, in this case, would be in the area marked extreme spatial bias. So it's very likely that working with pure text would be actually putting an extra learning barrier in the way. Alongside that, we produce for each individual a whole page of narrative, which, okay, it's not rocket science, but they are hints and tips that will help, we hope, will help teachers to understand what the meaning of these biases are and how they fit into working with the individual. Obviously, you are the ones that work with those individuals on a day-to-day basis, so you will know a lot more than this, but we hope that this will feed into that bigger picture. And now I think you wanted to cover this area, Jonathan?
Yeah, so we've looked now at that comparison to a certain extent between attainment and ability. And as Phil mentioned earlier on, it's where there's a disparity between those two that we need to try and identify if there are barriers to learning that we need to find out more about. There are two main areas of barriers to learning. Some of them are educational, ones that happen kind of in the classroom and directly linked to the learning process, and others which are more linked to the person and their attitudes. I'm going to look first at what you might call the educational ones. As Phil mentioned earlier on, new group reading tests can be used as an annual measure of reading and reading standards, reading attainment, but it can also be used as a measure to screen reading and used more frequently than perhaps an annual assessment in order to see how effective intervention has been to try and pick up on those who have weaker literacy skills. The two screeners, dyslexia and dyscalculia, are fairly self-explanatory. These screeners are very useful for trying to identify the early signs of both those areas. It is so vital for young children to have this picked up if they have this area of weakness, to have that picked up as soon as possible, because any kind of barrier in the areas of literacy and numeracy is really going to hold them back from the attainment that they might be able to achieve. And if we can pick that up early and do something about it, then there's every likelihood that we can build on their attainment. And similarly with the single word spelling test, again, a literacy-based assessment, but it's important to make sure that our children have a strength in spelling and are able to spell correctly, because that impacts on the exams that they take, the tests they do, and everything else linked to that. So looking at the new group reading test for a moment, earlier on when Phil was showing you the report from there were two areas, sentence completion and passage comprehension. And in a sense, this shows how that works. We're talking about the two strengths of decoding a piece of text and comprehension in terms of understanding it. Decoding, if you like, is the mechanical process of reading a piece of text and understanding what the words are and how they work, but not necessarily understanding what they mean. Let me give you an example. This is in another language, but I think it works. I can speak a certain amount of Spanish, so quite often I can look at a sentence in Spanish. I know how it's pronounced. I know how the sentence is constructed, but if I haven't got the vocabulary, I probably have no idea what it means. So I can decode that sentence, but I cannot understand it. And it's the combination of both of those together that takes us into the area of normal reading, be able to decode and understand at the same time what we're looking at. Here, I've given you an example of a new group reading test report where we're looking at groups and demographics within your school. This particular example is looking at gender, but you could easily be looking at other areas, SEND or English as an additional language, and so on. Here we have a representation in the graphs in the middle there that show how the boys are doing and how the girls are doing. And the rather even mountain line in the background is the national standard. So again, comparison with the national standards gives you an indication of how your boys, in this case, and how your girls are doing compared to their peers nationally. We always have that national standardization to work to and from. I mentioned that there are non-directly educational ones, and I want to talk about attitudes and perceptions in these barriers to learning. Quite often, the barriers may be brought in, portrayed, should I say, in terms of the attitudes that children bring into school with them. We have an assessment called Pupil Attitudes to Self and School, which we call PASS, and that really gets down to understanding what's going on in a young person's head. And that, together with the Kirkland-Rowell surveys that you have, will give you more in terms of what's going on in the school. Let me look at both of those individually just for a moment. PASS is an attitudinal survey that is really linked to learning, finding out how a student feels about themselves as a learner, how they feel about the place that they're learning, school, and the people that are teaching them. It will give you a very accurate picture of what's going on in a child's head in terms of learning. And most importantly, within that, you may well find that actually it's challenging your own perceptions of what a child is like, and may often bring to the fore aspects of a child's learning process that you are not aware of. PASS is not anonymous. This is very important. It allows you to drill right down through whole school and cohort level to the individuals so that you can identify those barriers to learning. It's also really useful for starting a conversation with parents or carers about their children, because it's not a teacher's subjective view that's being shown, it's actually the child's own view of themselves. And self-evaluation, I think, is fairly self-explanatory. I probably don't need to tell you too much about that. The Kirkland-Rowell stakeholder surveys are different. These are anonymous questionnaires, and there's 3 of them for the 3 groups of stakeholders: for parents, for pupils, and for staff. Again, they're giving you as a school feedback on what those 3 groups think is important, areas that could be developed and improved, and again, benchmarked to results from other similar schools. I think it's important to triangulate these 3 questionnaires together, because quite often issues that come up on one questionnaire may be reflected differently in one or both of the other surveys, so that you can really identify what the problem is and then work a strategy to get around that. These surveys are vital, all three of the Kirkland-Rowell surveys, but also the PASS assessment in terms of preparing for an inspection. Have let's look at some of those combination reports that Phil mentioned earlier on. We have a number of these for you to look at. We have reports for you where we compare. At the moment, we're looking at progress in English and progress in maths compared with CAT, and these will shortly, later on this year, develop into the progress test English, progress test maths, and progress test science assessments, and putting them together with the cognitive abilities test. We also have where CAT is compared with the new group reading test to give you comparisons there between ability and attainment. And further down the line, we will be bringing to you the cognitive abilities test compared with PASS, the pupil attitudinal survey that I was just mentioning just now. The purpose of these is really to give you some comparisons between the ability and the attainment and try and throw up where the results show that there is something not quite right. So in this example, once again, you may not be able to see that terribly clearly. That's not tremendously important at this stage. But what I'm showing you here is a comparison between CAT4 verbal and the new group reading test overall, both using standard age scores so that we can make a comparison between them. Next to that, there is a category that shows how the comparison between those two is rated as to whether it's higher than expected, lower than expected, or actually as expected. Next along there, we've got a CAT4 quantitative standard age score being compared with the progress in maths overall standard age score. And again, looking at the discrepancy between those two. We have the other CAT4 scores on there as well, the non-verbal and spatial and the mean, and that's really to throw those in so that that you've got the complete picture there. Looking here at the maths profile where CAT is concerned, in this one we've got boys and girls. The blue dots are the boys and the red or pink dots are the girls, to show what progress they have made across not progress so much as comparisons to see how they have done between their two assessments. So on the left-hand side there, we've got the progress in maths standard age score, and above that the CAT4 quantitative SPA9. You can compare that to, actually at the bottom is the quantitative standard age score. This then shows you what progress they've made. If they're in the blue above the white area, they will have made a lot of progress. If they're down in the white area, it's average progress. And if they're down in the green area, they've made lower than expected progress. So this is to give you a picture of how these children are doing. Here, Alongside that, further down the report, you will find some narrative that is going to give you a bit more information. For us, the children in your surveys are just that. They're children in surveys. We don't know them. They're statistics, if you like, for us. You know them. If I go back to the start of this, we talked about teacher assessment being important. And this is where it really plays up, because we can tell you the data that's come out of the assessment, but you need to have your knowledge added to that in order to put it into context. So here, for example, looking at these, are there any of the students in this group still acquiring English? We can't tell that, but you know that. And there are some suggestions for what may be appropriate for students in that situation. Was progress in maths administered at the recommended point in the year? And so on. There are some questions there just to help you put this whole thing into context. And below that, you will see the names of the individual children who are in those areas. And there will be an area for each, whether they're much lower or lower than expected, whether they're lower than expected, as expected, and so on. So the children are all in there and put into their appropriate groups. Now I'm going to hand back to Phil, who's going to try and give you an example of how you can put these together in a triangulation story.
Yes, I mean, I think the combination reports are a very useful step forward in pairing up those groups. But even without the ones that are still to follow, it is possible to look at the individual reports and to get an idea, I think, of how in combination they tell a much more powerful story than any one of them that tells on their own. So I should say that Victoria Thomas doesn't exist. There may be a Victoria Thomas out there, but this data is just made up as a kind of illustration of how we might use that data within triangulation. So I'm going to do a bit of it. Jonathan's going to chip in, so let's get on with it. If I just take you this first slide, this is part of the group report for the CAT test, and there we can see students' names, verbal, quantitative, non-verbal, spatial batteries overall. And there's the highlighted one in a kind of pale yellow, and that's the Victoria Thomas that we're going to be using as our example. In blue handwriting at the top of the screen is a kind of simulated annotation from a teacher, as if they were coming across these reports. So let's do the same. Victoria Thomas, she's got a standardized score of 112, 111, 112, 114 in the 4 batteries. Pretty consistent. Are they high? Well, they're around the middle, but they are at the high end of average. So they are bordering on above average. And in fact, they're probably putting you somewhere in the region of the top 20% of the population. So high end, yes. The GR column is group rank, which gives the position within the school or the cohort being assessed. And that's coming out as equal 10, equal 9, equal 8, equal 9. So again, very consistent across the batteries, and I would say high within the school. I think it's quite useful to be able to see the national picture against the inside the school picture. That's that scatter graph we had a look at before as an example, but this is Victoria. And does it confirm what we thought? Yes. That score is in the white area, which is where there's little statistical difference between the verbal and the spatial. So I'd expect her to be equally good at extracting information by text or in other ways. Probably multi-skilled in that way. We can also see at the same time that score is off towards the top right-hand corner, so that means they're high general ability. Pretty much what we got out of the group report, but in a very clear, visual way. If that's all I knew, and I just looked at CAT, and I was just using that within my kind of silo or department within the school, or keeping that to SLT, then perhaps all I would be thinking is, yes, a bright girl shouldn't be having problems, and that would be my expectation. But I think Jonathan's now going to show that that's maybe not true.
So from looking at her ability and seeing how she is, we've now got her pass scores. And if you remember, this is how Victoria sees herself as a learner. And these are the 9 areas that we measure within pass. And you probably can't read that too much. She's the 4th student down. So let me just show you this a bit more clearly. This is Victoria's past profile, looking at her as an individual. I've extracted that from the Excel file. And what I think this shows, which is interesting, is that Victoria is quite happy to come into school. She has a high general work ethic. Her attendance attitude is high, pretty strong attitude towards her staff. So school's not a problem to come to, but the areas, her attitudes to the areas that link to the curriculum are surprisingly low. Her preparedness for learning, her metacognition, how she feels that she's been prepared to learn, very, very low. Her self-regard as a learner is very low. Her linking to the curriculum, how she feels she relates to that curriculum, is still low. This is a very different picture from the picture we just had from Kat. A worrying picture, you might add. And in fact, if I go back a slide, we can see that the notes here show that there are concerns. And metacognition is very, very low. You wouldn't think that this is the profile of a girl who, ability-wise, should be in the top 20% of her group. So we've got a big disparity here between what her ability suggests and what her personal attitudes to herself as a learner are. So now I think we're going to go back to Phil, who's going to look at the attainment scores so we can complete, if you like, the triangle of looking at her attainment this time to match that with the ability and the attitude.
Yeah, absolutely. So these are the attainment measures, and this particular example is the progress test maths. And we've highlighted again, not in yellow this time, but a little arrow, Victoria's scores along the line here. Standardised score, 113. If you think back to the CAT, that would be about right. We had 112, 111, and so on, quite commensurate with the ability measure. And in terms of NPR, or National Percentile Rank, again, performance this time, rather than ability, reflected in that top 20%. So really, this is unlike the past. This is reflecting, in terms of maths performance, what I would perhaps wouldn't be unexpected from the ability measure. Let's have a look at another one. This isn't maths. This is English. Progress test English. Again, she's highlighted standardised age score 101. Well, 101 is pretty much UK national average. There's nothing wrong with being UK national average. It's merely that, according to that ability measure, she should be actually not at the 50th percentile, where we've got 50% doing roughly better and 50% doing worse, but actually it was more the expectation she'd be in the top 20%. So there obviously is a problem here. If that's English, maybe we could dig a little bit further. This is a new group reading test for Victoria. Again, we've gone back to the yellow here, highlighting. And in terms of standardised score, way down, 90. Now you might say, oh, well, that's only 10 difference in terms of standardised score from the UK average. Around the average, so many students get those scores that small changes there are huge in terms of the distribution of their score. So 90 here really is now putting her, in terms of reading, in the bottom 26%, whereas, just one more time, in terms of ability, it was the complete opposite. And using the parts of new group reading test, we can see that in terms of that decoding, that mechanistic part of the group reading test, the new group reading test, that particularly low. That comprehension is considerably higher. Now, in terms of that annotation, we've said that perhaps there could be a dyslexia problem. That's because often dyslexic problems do manifest themselves in a greater ability to understand the text than in actually being able to cope, as Jonathan's talked about, in that the rules and decoding exactly what it says. So that would certainly be a possibility. But at this level, I think we'd have to do much more in terms of diagnostic testing, where we can work individually and look. But just from this, I think you can see how just 3 or 4 different assessments together that we've really started to unpick a possible problem. And also it reinforces that it really is about assessment in partnership. All of this works so much better if it's taken with your individual knowledge But it may show people who have fallen through the cracks. It may give us a greater insight. It's certainly on occasions, I know when I was teaching, that you would find people that you perhaps didn't have a great high expectation on a daily basis because you've got used to a consistent standard. And then to see where ability was very different, it was a real eye-opener. Anyway, we've not been able to do much more than scratch the surface, really. So the next steps, I think, are pretty much would be to get in touch with your local area consultant. Rather than have a huge list here, this is a link to a page on our website where we've got the details of the local area consultants, the areas they cover, their contact details. And I think that conversation about how this might be useful within your school environment, and these are free consultations, would be probably for us the next steps. I don't know how you feel, John.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I think the answer is very much along the lines of getting in touch with one of our consultants, having a conversation with them, telling them about your situation and your needs, and allowing them to discuss that with you.